Um, accept this recording. I want just to acknowledge my wonderful team of Heather and Marissa. They both were really instrumental in this work. Marissa is a graduate student at Bentley, and Heather was on our senior team, and they both really did an amazing job in kind of helping formulate this um, work. So, just a brief background about kind of who we are. For those of you that are not familiar, the User Experience Center at Bentley University has been around for more than 20 years. You can see this beautiful pre-COVID photograph of our campus and our building where we're housed. We're affiliated with the master's program in Human Factors and Information Design, which is essentially user experience. In our center, the User Experience Center is kind of the professional services arm of UX at Bentley. So we work with clients around the world. We've worked with about 250 companies now in our 20 years, and we have both students and full-time staff working on those projects. So I wanted to kind of introduce this concept of a scorecard. So in our work, we see that our clients are really sort of focused on either really kind of detailed design preferences. Do people prefer this image over this image, or this design over that design, or things that are much more kind of tactical on a usability level, things around their performance on maybe a few key tasks. So most clients are kind of focused very much kind of in the weeds of kind of what's going on in terms of the user experience. And they have a real difficult time seeing the big picture of the overall experience. It's almost as if we're all sort of getting these little pieces of the puzzle, but we can't see that whole picture. Some people say Net Promoter Score or CSAT kind of give us some general indication, but that's really not enough. It's a very kind of, those are really kind of blunt instruments in terms of overall temperature. Are people sort of liking our product or not? And this is a real challenge, and this was kind of one of our motivations, is to be able to kind of see the big picture of the experience. And furthermore, there isn't a kind of a tool that is widely available for our clients or organizations to see the big picture. And in people that do try to do it, kind of have a very lengthy process. It's costly. They'll want to try to cobble together different types of research studies. And it can be a big deal. It can be a long, expensive process to try to see that big picture. So, you know, when we talk to our clients, they're kind of asking around, first, kind of how are we doing? So typically somebody will say, I need one number or one indication of what's the user experience on our product, whether it's a website or app or physical product. They also want to know, what do we need to improve? Like, where are the areas in our product that are underperforming, especially relative to our competition? So they'll want to know how we're doing and what do we need to improve. And then also, how do we compare? So metrics are relative, right? So anytime you're looking at a UX metric, it doesn't mean a lot until you have some point of comparison. So for example, you know, if you're looking at some kind of satisfaction score or what have you, it's really important to be able to know, well, this is where we're doing better than our competition or underperforming. You may have a competitive advantage or you may have a disadvantage. So these are kind of the three high-level questions that our clients are coming to us wanting to know. And we're sort of using that for our motivation. So in addition to those fundamental questions, we want to, through our scorecard work, is to make data more accessible, right? So we want the data to be used by easily accessed and used by a whole variety of different teams within an organization. It's also got to foster cross-team buy-in. So we want not just folks from UX or user research, but from marketing, from analytics, from the business side, to be able to kind of look at and leverage this type of data and this scorecard in particular. And we want to help clients understand their experience overall, to see that big picture, but at the same time, identify those underperforming areas and see opportunities to say, okay, overall our experience is great, but maybe that there's this aspect around the design or these tasks or this part of usability is underperforming, and that's where we need to really focus our energies. And all of that together is going to drive change. That is what we're about, is using the data to ultimately drive change, to deliver a better experience for customers. And so our requirements in our scorecard. First, we wanted something that has a multi-dimensional view. We wanted just to go beyond usability and take a very kind of broad, holistic view on experience. We want to collect data about what users value. And I'll go into this in more detail later, but this is really important. It's what do people actually care about, and how are we measuring against that? We want to give our clients a diagnostic with kind of an at-a-glance result. So maybe somebody from the senior leadership team can look at a scorecard and say, okay, there's a problem, or there's a problem. We're doing well here and not so well there. So we didn't want this to be kind of big long reports. We wanted this to be kind of an at-a-glance result. We want to do work or our scorecard that's comparative. So again, the metrics are relative, and we wanted to be able to see how does one company stack up against another. And the last requirement of our scorecard is it's got to be lean. So we wanted to be able to collect the data that is in a very kind of efficient way and very low cost. There's a lot of different technical solutions, and I'll share ours in a little bit, but this kind of very lean component is a very important piece of the scorecard to really make it work. Okay, so kind of in summary, the Bentley scorecard is going to provide our clients with metrics across all critical aspects of the experience. So not just usability, but we're going to be looking at brand and the design, as well as the emotional experience. We want to provide a clear picture of the overall experience. So this again involves kind of a single number that says a lot about this big picture. It's going to be lean and budget friendly, and also repeatable. So we want to be able to track progress over time and see how it works kind of on a competitive basis. So these are sort of the almost like our North Star, kind of what we're using to sort of develop this scorecard. Okay, so let me get into the actual development of the scorecard. So our development process kind of followed a several step process. So the first thing is identifying requirements. So Heather and Marissa and I spent a good chunk of the summer looking at all the literature and trying to figure out what are the different, when we talk about user experience, what does that really mean, right? Not just at a high level, but how do we sort of deconstruct that? What are those kind of distinct elements? Once we identified those requirements, we developed a methodology. So we developed a survey instrument to try to tap into all those different aspects of the user experience. And then we ran a pilot test. So we collected data, we analyzed it, and then we developed the scorecard. So I just want to really emphasize here that we're still in the initial process. We have not gone through a formal validation yet. For folks that know me, I'm all about the rigor. So that is one of our next steps, is to kind of go through a formal validation. But what we want to share now is kind of a pre-validation scorecard. So when we look at the overall user experience, there's kind of 4 different dimensions that we identified: the usability, the emotional experience, um, the attitudes or preferences around the brand, and design and content. And I'll go over each of those in just a moment. But there's 2 other important elements too that I'll also talk about. One is creating a personalized score for each individual, and also looking at the gap between expectations and experience, because we know from early research that that is one of the biggest drivers in overall satisfaction. So that personalization and expectations are kind of 2 different lenses that we have when we're looking at these different dimensions. There are 4 critical aspects of experience. The first is usability, and this probably shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. So this is about how easy it is to complete a task, about how easy it is to learn, for example, a website, the amount of effort. So the things that we're looking at were ease of navigation, the organization of the site, ease of use, and usefulness. So really kind of core elements around the usability. The second aspect is emotion. Now, we certainly recognize that there are many different potential emotions that are involved in user experience. And what we just kind of distilled down 4 distinct emotions that we think are most relevant to most digital experiences: frustration, confidence, engagement, and stress. So these are, again, how somebody feels when they're using a website, for instance. The third being brand. And brand, I think, is often overlooked when we talk about user experience, but people aren't coming in with kind of a clean slate. They have certain expectations around a brand, and that's driving a lot of their experience, to be honest. So how is the company perceived, such as the trustworthiness, the value of the products, the likelihood of using in the future. So we examine things like the interest, the positivity around the brand, desire to use it, and trust. And the fourth and final aspect of experience that we looked at is design and content. Design and content, we see as somewhat different, but they, at least at a high level, they sort of merge into one larger bucket. Things around visual attractiveness, the usefulness of the graphics and images, understandability of the content and the language, and the usefulness of the information. So these are sort of the 4 different aspects that when we looked at user experience, we sort of deconstructed, sort of a construct validity exercise, if you will, for those folks that are familiar with that idea. Here is a real high-level picture of kind of all those different elements that we were looking at in terms of the experience. So usability, emotion, brand, and design and content. You'll see usefulness actually kind of popped up both from a usability perspective, but also in terms of a design and content perspective. So now I want to talk a little bit about the personalization of the experience score. And there's kind of 2 different elements. First is we wanted to make sure that the experience is based on things that people actually do that are relevant to them. And we also wanted to base the scorecard on what people actually care about, right? What do they care about the most? And their score should be reflective of that. So this is how we dealt with the relevance of the tasks. So we gave people kind of a limited laundry list of, in our case, I think it was 8 tasks, but this is just to illustrate the idea. And we said, which of these types of tasks or categories of tasks are most relevant, most useful to you? And they maybe selected categories 2, 3, and 5. And then once they did that, we showed at least a couple very specific tasks that were only relevant to that particular task category. And then they self-selected, let's say 3. In our case, it was 4 different tasks. So they're choosing from a fairly finite list of tasks, things that they actually do that they care about. The second piece, and try to follow along here, I hope this isn't too confusing, is around scoring people based on what aspects of the experience that they care most about. So what we did was we said, okay, we're going to give you 100 points, and we want you to essentially distribute those points to the 4 different dimensions. So we defined usability, we defined emotion, brand, design, and content at a very high level, and said basically, what do you care about the most? So for example, let's say for the individual at the top, design and content might mean a lot, and for somebody the emotional experience could mean a lot, or usability, etc. So everybody has kind of a different weighting, if you will, things that they care about. And this is what we did is, in terms of personalization, most instruments that try to measure assume that everybody cares about the same things equally. And we know that that's not true, right? So if we said we're going to weight usability and design and brand and emotion equally, these might be what the scores look like, okay? However, based on an individual score, we weighted things differently. So now the first person who scored an 80 now may score a 95, or somebody who scored an 85 could score a 73 because of how they weighted different kind of concepts, the design and usability, etc. So this is much more reflective of what's going on in terms of their own experience. We're not all the same. We shouldn't treat people in terms of their experience in the same way. Okay, so let me get to our data collection strategy. So what did we do? So for our technology challenge is that first we wanted something budget friendly. We looked at a lot of different platforms and we wanted something that would be very low cost to do. We wanted something that would be easy to use, both in terms of setup from a researcher standpoint, as well as from the end user, the participant perspective. And we wanted to be able to certainly capture feedback, all the different self-report data. And then we wanted to ideally capture behavior around their performance. And this is where there's a bit of a question mark, as you can see, and I'll talk more about this later, but I think this is still kind of open for debate about how do we capture behavior in a way that satisfies these other 3 kind of requirements from a technology or platform perspective. So this was our very simple technical solution, okay? So we have access to a Qualtrics survey platform, and the way it worked was we would give people task instructions, we asked some background questions, and then we gave people a link to a website, and they went off to another tab, another browser, they performed that task, then they bounced back, they answered questions, they got the instructions for the next task, then they basically toggled between the survey in the website in 2 different tabs or browsers that aren't talking to one another, right? So this is, again, our simple technical solution. And then they came back to the survey for post-task ratings, et cetera, demographics. So this was certainly budget friendly. This was easy. I mean, everyone was able to do it. It's not perfect because not everything is contained within kind of the same platform. And it's also limited because we weren't able to capture things around clicks. But our goal is to really measure kind of the overall sentiment of what's going on. And we think that we did that very effectively. So we ran a pilot test. We had 4 tasks, the same tasks on 2 different websites. In our case, we used IKEA and Target. We had a small and non-representative sample, so between subjects design. So the data that I'm going to show you is just illustrative. It is not meant to be like, oh, IKEA is better than Target or vice versa. It's really just a demonstration of what this data can look like. And the study took about 10 to 15 minutes to complete overall. So very easy to collect a lot of data very quickly. So this is the scorecard of what it looks like from a high level. It was on 2 different pages, and I will go over kind of each dimension now, which you've been waiting for, right? So the first is the overall experience score. So we normalized everything to a 100-point scale across those 4 different dimensions. And in this case, we're looking at the data for IKEA. IKEA scored an 87, which we think is very good. And what you can see is usability, 32.8, contributed more to that score than something like the emotional experience. And that's because usability was weighted more heavily by the participants than something like the emotional experience. And it compares to IKEA. It exceeded, Target, where you can see Target a score of about 80, where that differs, right? So you can see usability was the primary determinant in that score. So that was a big difference between the two websites. So again, we're looking at kind of these weighted averages across the 2 different sites. The second thing is expectations and experience. So at the beginning of the study, when people chose the tasks, we had them give an expectation rating on ease of use, usefulness, organization, and look and feel. And then once they finished it, we then asked them to actually rate their experience. And we wanted to do is look at the gap. And what you can see here is that for IKEA, the expectations, the actual experience exceeded their expectations for usefulness, organization, and look and feel. So they didn't have a real high expectation, but their actual experience was much better. And we see a similar but not quite of a strong pattern with Target. So we're always looking for, an experience to meet or exceed that expectation. So this is a real kind of important dimension in looking at kind of what's driving overall experience. This next piece of the snapshot is really important. And what we wanted to do is to kind of create a map based first off on level of importance. So this is kind of the average weighting. So when we ask people to distribute their 100 points, you can see 37 points were distributed for usability, and less so for the other 3 dimensions. So usability, at least for these sites, is weighted more heavily. And then on the right, you can see this really nice colorful chart here. We wanted to map the weights with the actual average experience ratings. So just imagine something that's rated very important. So maybe, 30, 40, 50, where the experience is very low. That would be a real high priority area for improvement, right? And conversely, something that is rated very low importance, and the experience is very high, should have a very low rating. So what we see here is something like emotion that didn't have a real high weighting, but the experience rating was rated a little bit lower. Something like usability weighted more heavily, but the experience was a little bit higher. So this is kind of a way for us to kind of prioritize which dimensions of your site are having kind of the most challenges. Where should we be paying attention, or maybe devoting resources, or doing a deeper dive into what's going on? The next thing we wanted to look at is kind of doing some market segmentation. So for example, looking at the difference between customers and prospects. And here we see a big difference between IKEA and Target. So for prospects, IKEA was really delivering a great experience at 98, versus for Target, people that had not been to the Target website, it was not doing so well at all. So big difference there. much less of a difference and pretty high for both. So that kind of suggests that there's some kind of learnability potential issues going on. Perhaps things around the brand as well. So for example, look at the usability between 40 and 17 for prospects. So really that would be kind of a big area of concern. And of course, there's a lot of different ways we could slice and dice this data, whether it's by age or income, etc. The next two pieces of the scorecard are starting to get a little bit more granular in looking at specific tasks. So we had an overall task rating of 4.3. So this is after somebody does each task and they're rating it on a number of different dimensions. On a 5-point scale, and we can see the different kind of class or category of tasks that are doing well. For example, finding specific product information, browsing did well. Things around services, for example, store hours or delivery, things around delivery, etc., scored much lower. And then here on the right, you can see a task comparison, so we can see how does IKEA and Target stack up against each other with in terms of the ease to complete, the time, satisfaction, and how it was designed. You can see really comparable between the two. And the last piece of the scorecard is around the task evaluations. So this was kind of a way to sort of take a deeper dive into kind of what's actually going on. So over on the left side, this is kind of almost like a heat map to show you where are the potential problems. So we have task categories like browsing for products or finding information about a product, services, and store information, crossed with the ease to complete, the time, satisfaction, and design. And we see there is something going on with the design relative to the services. All right, versus product information that scored really high kind of across the board, right? So this is kind of to say this area perhaps, or these types of tasks are problematic. And then on the right is an actual list of the tasks, right? So we have things around like these are the different 8 tasks on IKEA, and we can see things like finding a set of tumblers or the measurements of a sofa. Assembly instructions are all great. Average rating is really high versus things around like the weekend hours or find out if they have a service to assemble a product are scoring low. So this kind of gives product teams specifically a way to kind of pinpoint where their potential problems lie. This is what the scorecard looks like. These are the kind of the 6 different pieces of it. Again, this is not set in stone, but this is what we think would be most relevant to both a research group as well as kind of senior leadership of what the experience is like. And kind of wrapping up in terms of next steps. The first thing is we want to collect more data and be able to iterate the scorecard. Certainly not perfect. And we want to be able to iterate based on collecting a lot more data on a lot of different websites. And we want to then validate the scorecard. I mentioned that before. It's not been formally validated, but we want to do some validation exercises. This might involve certainly kind of a test retest methodology or parallel testing, different ways of kind of validating any kind of survey instrument. And then we want to build a normative database. We want to be able to develop enough or build enough data to know, how different maybe across retail or finance or healthcare sites are doing. We're not, SUS has been around for decades. I think SUS is awesome, but SUS the system usability scale, one of the great things about it, it's got a normative database behind it, but it also is really just looking at one slice of the experience. So the last thing I wanted to mention before I jump into questions is we would love to partner with you. So please reach out if you're interested in possibly working with us to develop a scorecard for your organization. So we're totally open to any different type of group, different type of company and product. We want to be able to really kick the tires on the scorecard and develop more data and kind of further refine it and deliver value, help you drive change within your organization. So I hope I wasn't speaking too quickly. I hope you understand. I see that there's a lot of questions out there, so I'm going to try to take these one at a time, and please feel free to add your questions as we sort of go through them. Okay, the first one that came in right at the very beginning is an easy one. What does NPS stand for? I'm sorry about the acronyms. Net Promoter Score, widely used not just in UX, but in market research. So if you search NPS or Net Promoter Score, it's a single question. Would you recommend this product to a friend or colleague on a 10-point scale? And that's been widely validated. So, so that is what NPS is. I'm going to see if I can use this. How is the criticality of a given aspect of the design determined? How is the criticality of a given aspect? So if I understand the question correctly, we basically said through our literature review and really going in through the data is identify these 4 different dimensions of user experience. We define them, and then each individual was presented with a brief description of usability with example, same for brand, design and content, and emotion, and they distributed their 100 points based on what matters most to them. So I hope that I'm answering your question there. Is the dimension of the scorecard you refer mostly to the website of a brand? Do you see the experience scorecard also extends to other digital product like apps? Absolutely. We do not want this to be specific to any particular technology or platform. We designed this, originally we designed this actually when Heather and Marissa and I were working. We wanted to look at the whole end-to-end experience. So cross-platform, across channel, and have it work across everything. Then kind of COVID hit and we knew we couldn't do in-person store visits and things like that. But we certainly hope that this works across platform and channel. And certainly the brand, depending on the channel, may change. There's certainly the kind of overall brand that a company has, but it may differ based on the channel. Okay, so the question from Susan, my friend. Nice to see you again. How did you select these elements of emotion? Half on your list are negative emotions. What about delight? How might framing inquiry on positive emotions inform the design and engagement? Okay, so yeah, so you're absolutely right. Two of them were negative, yeah, what we wanted to do, I didn't actually mention this, but in our efforts to try to keep this scorecard or data collection to a minimum, we wanted to have just 4 elements of each of those different aspects. Certainly delight could be a 5th one. We looked at that and we weren't sure how people would interpret that. That's something we definitely would like to look at. And in terms of the positive and negative dimensions, we did organize it. I'm not going into the specifics of the instrument itself, but everything went along from a negative to positive, even though we were looking at two different kind of negative emotions. Okay. Is there a minimum weight for a category that a participant can choose? No, there wasn't. Somebody could, if they only cared about usability, they could put all 100 points to that and 0 against the other 3, or any combination. So that's something that could be done. I don't know off the top of my head if anyone did that. I would imagine some people did, but again, we need a much larger database, a data set to look at that. Okay. How did you compute the weights based on the responses? So without going too much into the math, the weights were determined by each individual. So for example, if somebody scored or put a weight of 50 against usability and 25 against two other dimensions, that had 2 times the weight, right, as the other two. So the weights were self-driven, and then we use those weights for each score. So for example, if your overall rating on usability was X and you had a 2X weighting, it's now 2X, right? Or if you didn't weight it very much for emotion, maybe your score is then cut in half. So I'm sort of not going through kind of the details of the mechanics of that, but that's generally kind of how it worked. In the dimension of the scorecard, you refer mostly to the website of, oh yeah, I already answered that, sorry. John Dozier, an old colleague. Can you talk a little bit more about the different category tasks and tasks the participants performed? Are you able to provide examples of the different categories and tasks they selected from, and how did you ensure all the tasks were completed equally? Good questions. I don't have here, I'll show you, John. Here are the here are the task categories. They weren't obviously like this, but this is just kind of an abbreviation. So things like browsing for tasks, like finding a set of tumblers or the measurements of a couch, I believe. Product information, store information, what are the weekend hours. So we when they were presented that, they were shown the different task categories, and that's when they kind of said, oh yeah, like I'm always looking for store information and product information. And then they were given that set of tasks, of which they chose 4. We didn't we weren't trying to get people to get an equal number. We knew that we wouldn't, but most importantly, we wanted people to choose things that were relevant. We're hoping with a much larger sample size, we would get at least a minimum sample for all the relevant tasks with enough people in the study. We're certainly about getting the statistical power so we can do all of our tests of significance, et cetera. But we weren't striving to get kind of a minimum number. The most important thing is that people were doing the things that they care about and basing it off of that. with the technical solution toggling between Qualtrics and the website, were you concerned about self-selection bias? For example, someone who found toggling too difficult may not have completed the study. Oh, good question. You know, yeah, I mean that's a fair point. We really tested it out. We had an illustration of kind of how it worked. Um, I think we talked to everybody afterwards, and no one said anything about it. But certainly in our next round with a much larger sample size, that's something that we would want to look at and try to identify. Perhaps we could build something into the survey of somebody who um, exhibited a pattern that showed that there was difficulty in doing that type of activity. But yeah, it's definitely kind of still kind of kind of an open question right now. Prospects versus customers. Are prospects people who have never been to the website before? Yeah, I believe that's how we defined it. Either have never been or haven't been maybe in the last 2 years, or however we defined it. But that's kind of a common split or market segment that our businesses look at. And in that case, kind of tells us a lot about what was driving the score. It was really the prospects that were struggling on target as opposed to the current customers. What are the steps to create this type of dashboard at my company? Well, I guess there's two different ways. One is you can partner with us. Send me an email, go to our website and reach out. We'd love that. Or if you want to do this internally, is you can try to use some of this as kind of a broad framework and develop it internally, and find out what does your company care about. You know, what dimensions of user experience maybe are most relevant. You know, I think all this is kind of within you know, a research group might be able to put together. Yeah, either road, but I really do encourage folks to do this if you can, because I think it gives so much insight into, again, that big picture, but also kind of where the problems, where should we focus our resources. Were the tasks for Target similar to IKEA? Yes, they were almost exactly the same, except for like the name of the sofa. We try to keep them as apples to apples as we could. Yeah, so they were almost exactly the same, and that's a real important piece. Is that the tasks on both sites have to be highly comparable. If a user's is the user asked to time how long it takes them to complete an activity? No, but through Qualtrics we put in page timers, so we were actually able to time the gap between when they went off to the website and when they came back to answer the question. So we do have the time data. But what we thought, because we wanted to kind of measure the overall sentiment, we wanted to be able to, we asked them about here, like, was the time reasonable? So it's really relative to your expectations, right? So you can see for services that took a little bit longer probably than people thought was reasonable. And we do have that time data. Product information, people were doing lightning fast, and so it was highly reasonable. So we are getting at that time data through the measurement, actual measurement, and also getting a self-report on the reasonableness of the time. And I'll also mention with the time data is that obviously there's people that can we call them satisficers or mental cheaters that essentially are just trying to get through the survey as fast as possible. So we can use that time data to kind of potentially filter out those individuals. So we want to make sure we have a really clean data set, and looking at the time between responses is one of the most effective ways of doing that. Boy, I love your guys' questions. This is awesome. So many. I'm not sure I'm going to get through all of them. Um, in your opinion about having two different scorecards, one for executive viewing and one for product teams? Yeah, absolutely. I think you know, depending on who you're talk to is having you know, one breakdown. For example, I would say to me the most important pieces are this right here. So this is the overall, you got an 87, this is what's driving it, and this is how you compare to your competition. And then the second being this one right here of kind of where should you prioritize your efforts. So if I was going to choose just two visualizations for your senior leadership team, those would be the two. The others you could probably share maybe with more the product owners, business analysts, designers, etc. How will you validate the scorecard? Oh, I knew that there was going to be a question on that. Great question. There are different types of validation. There's internal validation, external validation, construct validation. What we're going to probably have to do is do some type of, in content validation. We'll probably have to do some type of content validation in construct validation. So construct validation would essentially be kind of a further analysis to make sure that when we talk about user experience, what does that mean? What are the different elements? So you can think of usability, where that work's already been done. They talk about effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction is kind of the three dimensions of usability. But what are those dimensions of user experience? We sort of put our stake in the ground and said, these are what we consider to be kind of four distinct dimensions of user experience, but we'll need to be able to validate that with other research and with other experts in the field. And then we'll also go through a validation where we do kind of a test retest. So for example, maybe we run the scorecard on the IKEA website with 200 people, and then we do the same thing again with 200 different people, and we should get a very similar response. So if the instrument is good, it's reliable, we would get a similar pattern of results. There's a lot of different work around that validation piece, but it's something that we're certainly committed to doing. Did you consider using site metrics in the scorecard at all? Thinking about a SaaS type versus shopping site, so data like repeat use, frequency, user retention, time to start. Repeat use, frequency, user retention. No, I mean, that's an interesting question. What we wanted to do is have these. I think those metrics are really important from a business standpoint, but usually it's kind of a reflection of the experience, the value that is being provided to the end user, the customer. It would be interesting to do a market segmentation, for example, based on frequency of use, or try to correlate it with retention, things like that. Like, how does this 87 or this particular score, does this predict, is your predictive power of that to some other behavioral metrics or business metrics? That would be really cool. We're not there yet. But I think those metrics that you're talking about are are somewhat separate from a UX metric. I wish if we had an open discussion on this, I would love to follow up with you and hear more of your thoughts about that. So I hope I answered your question okay. Um, how did you select users to provide feedback? Were there any incentives to participate? Um, Yeah, this is what we call a sample of convenience. These were folks from Bentley. These were mostly graduate students and some friends and family. Very small sample size. Can't emphasize enough. Don't read too much into this, or don't read it all into this data. It's really just to be illustrative of the type of data we can collect. We actually did share this with IKEA. They were really thought it was really cool and very interesting. So um, yeah, so sample of convenience. I would imagine in terms of a sample size, we would want probably at least about 200 people in each group so we can do some kind of segmentation. We'll end up with a margin of error of about plus or minus 4.5% on a lot of those metrics with an N of 200. What's the platform you're using? So again, we are using a combination of well, using Qualtrics as our survey platform, but you could probably set it up in any other survey platform. I don't know about Google Forms. It's much more rudimentary. I love Qualtrics. I have nothing to do with the company, but I'm a huge fan. Um, there's some other survey tools out there where you might be able to sort of replicate something like this. And then they're toggling between the site and the website and um, the survey. Now you could certainly do it with a mobile app. We did look into other platforms like UserZoom and Loop 11 and Userlytics too, but I think they were a little bit too expensive for us. Why the sus versus super Q? Um, I'm not sure what you mean by that. I'm familiar with both, but we didn't use either in our study, in our scorecard. Um, but the super Q and like other things too have normative databases as well. So if that's what you're referring to, um, that is a real power, a real kind of benefit to instruments that have been validated, and there's been a kind of a normative database that's been built up over time, so you can do that kind of competitive analysis, especially kind of within industry. Um, um, okay, I'm developing the first ever UX scorecard for my company, so this webinar came at a perfect time. Thank you. Thank you, Elsa. I'm so happy that this is useful. I hope it was for everybody else. Let me know how it goes. Um, have you ever done any enterprise IT experience scorecard, POC'd one of you? I'm not sure what that means. One of the years back, and the leadership at the time was doing an all IT scorecard, so we stopped and tried to just feed it. New leader again, so I'm ready to try again. Any tips for scorecards that are broader than one site and encompass across different apps and solutions? Great question, Marla. Yeah, that's Heather and Marissa and I, as I mentioned before, wanted to look at the end to end. I would do is probably have a scorecard that represents kind of that end-to-end experience, and then maybe separate lenses or views on different platforms or different channels, so you can kind of see where potential issues are lying. So one big scorecard, and then maybe smaller based on, again, those different platforms or channels. So but I think it's really important to have both. I think if you had one scorecard that was across the whole end-to-end experience, um, that might not give you the granularity you need to spot potential problems. Okay, we have time for just one or two more. Um, awesome work, guys. Thanks, Flavio. I'm trying to build something similar. Do you tried other criteria like usability, return of investment? Um, well, we had usability as one of our criteria. As you can see, return on of investment. I think that's something that you would want to try to correlate. Hopefully, there's a correlation between experience and ROI. There's been research that has shown it does correlate. So that's something you certainly would want to look at. Um, um, Marietta, does this work for professional services, not products? Um, yeah, I mean, this is any experience. Again, we wanted this to be agnostic, so you could look at this um, within a service design, right? A service experience. So it doesn't have to be I think that there might be some modification to the scorecard. This is kind of, but usability, brand, emotion certainly are relevant. Design may need to be tweaked a little bit, but I think it might work depending on the nature of the service. So, we didn't want this to be only digital. Okay, and let me see. Um, I'll just take the next one. Um, okay. Adam, really liked your methodology to measure UX. Thanks for the presentation. I'm coming from a larger company where some um, teams already tried similar approaches, but I'd be interested in trying out yours. I'm not in charge of deciding who to partner with. I'm just an individual contributor, but I'll definitely bring this to management. Oh, thank you so much. That'd be cool from Log Me In. Yeah, that would be awesome. Again, if any of you have further interest, please reach out. If you want a partner, awesome. If you want more details, that would be great too. And we'll follow up with an email with a link to the presentation. So share. Um, and thank you all for attending today. This was really, really awesome. So I wish you all the best and I hope it was useful. Take care.